Well, good morning, everyone. To give you a little background on my career. I spent most of my career in U.S. Forest Service, and quite a lot of it was in fire control or fire management. I spent 7 years or 9 years as the fire staff on the Kootenai National Forest, and I was 8 years in the regional office in fire management as fuels and fire ecologists. I spent a lot of time in my career over in the Lochsaw country, and this fire we're going to talk about today is happened down in that Lochsaw country. Maybe some of you know or heard the name Pete King, which happens to be the name of a creek near Lowell, Idaho. It was named for an early day prospector who had mining claims in the area and a cabin near the mouth of the drainage, which flows into the middle fork of the Clearwater. The site is now covered by US Highway 12 and the Lewis and Clark Highway. The only bearing that has in this discussion is that in 1934, a forest fire of monstrous proportions was named for the creek. It could have been called McClendon Butte or Martin Creek, but the name Pete King seems to be the one that comes through, just as in 1961, the mine fire in the Bitterroot National Forest was better known as Sleeping Child. Lowell, Idaho lies about 25 miles east of Kuski in the north central Idaho and about 125 miles west of Missoula. A little arrow there points to the town of Lowell. At the time of the fire, 1934, there was no road to the area from the Montana side of the Bitterroot Divide. There was a primitive road from Lolo Hot Springs, west of Missoula, over Lolo Pass to the Powell Ranger Station, which was about right there. But it ended there, and it wasn't until 1962 that a through highway is completed to Kuski, Idaho, and points west. In 1934, this area was mostly wilderness. There were a few primitive roads. The Lolo Trail Road, which follows the divide between the Lochsaw River and the North Fork of the Clearwater, which is along in there someplace, was being completed during that year. A road from Kuski, Idaho, the headquarters of the Selway National Forest at that time, extended up the middle fork of the Clearwater River to the town of Lowell and on up the Selway to the falls. There was also a road from Lowell up the Lochsaw River to Bimmery Creek. The Lochsaw and Selway rivers join at Lowell to form the middle fork of the Clearwater. There were homesteads along the middle fork and ranger stations. The one at Pete King, which was a mile up the Lochsaw from Lowell, and O'Hara, which was now called the Fenn Ranger Station. It was up the Selway. There was also a ranger station at the Lochsaw up the river from Lowell, and Moose Creek, which was up the Selway quite a ways. And those two were inaccessible by road. The ranger districts were part of the Selway National Forest, which covered the lower Lochsaw and Selway drainages, plus the middle fork of the Clearwater. There was a network of pack trails over the area that gave access to the main ridges and drainages, and also to the fire lookout stations which are on prominent peaks. Telephone lines connected the forest headquarters with all the ranger stations. The fire lookout points were and some major trail junctions and the forest guard cabins. As Lewis and Clark noted in their journals during their journey west through Idaho, the area was heavily timbered. Clark wrote on September 14, 1804, "The mountains which we crossed today were much more difficult than those of yesterday. The last was particularly fatiguing, being steep and stony, broken by fallen timber and thickly overgrown by pine, spruce, fir, and tamarack. Tree growth was continuous over the area, and unless you were on a high ridge, there wasn't much opportunity to see out. The explorers also noted that fire and wind had ravaged some of the area. Deep canyons were numerous steep-sided tributaries characterized the Lochsaw and the Selway drainages. Abrupt rocky slopes rise from the river bottoms with little gradient break to the main ridges. Elevations range from 2,000 feet above sea level at Lowell to over 6,000 feet on the main ridges. The 30 plus inches of annual moisture, mostly in the form of snow, and rich granite soil, relatively mild temperatures provide for excellent tree growth. Except for the few roads and trails, man's hand was not much in evidence in the landscape in 1934. So except for burned areas and from numerous lightning fires, tree and brush growth was continuous. The tree species consisted of western red cedar in the stream bottoms, merging with grand fir, white pine, larch, Douglas fir on the canyon slopes. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir occupied the drier sites, but grand fir and cedar prevailed over much of the area. Jim Haubeck states in his fire ecology investigations in the Selway and Bitterroot area in 1972, fire has been influencing the Selway Bitterroot landscape seemingly forever. Its presence is recorded in the earliest written reports and histories prepared for the area. No area was observed during the summer of 1971 that did not reveal the direct evidence of past fire disturbance, even in the oldest forest communities encountered and in communities at all elevations. Much of the lower Lochsaw Selway area had been burned over in the fires of 1910, 17, and 19. These were single burns but covered large area. 75% of the 1934 fire was a reburn of these areas. Multiple burns were also reburned in 1934, but to a lesser degree. Hot, dry summers and numerous lightning storms were the norm in the Clearwater country. Moisture accompanied the storms varied by year and storm, but every few years, after a prolonged dry period, dry lightning storms would start numerous fires that accounted for large burned areas. Such was the situation in 1934. Past experience with fire suppression efforts in the canyons of the Lochsaw and Selway give testimony to the erratic effects that wind can have on fires in the area. Early in the history of the Forest Service fire control, a need to better understand fire weather and other factors affecting forest fire control was recognized. Mike Hardy states in his book entitled The Gisborne Area of Forest Fire Research that what amounted to a problem delineation appeared in a memorandum attached to the 1920 International Intermountain Fire Research Center, which urged that considerable more research sources should be directed to fire problems and recommended emphasis on economics of fire protection, origin, and behavior of fire, and the techniques of fire protection and the statistical analysis of data and problems. The problem was dealt with in 1922 with the appointment of H.T. Gisborne to fire research in the Priest River Experimental Forest. Hardy further states in his book that Gisborne started coming to the Selway area about 1929. He set up some of his first weather stations, and most notably his fuel moisture sticks and Duff hygrometers. And with that, some inflammability stations that he installed at Pete King and O'Hara stations. These stations in 1933 began to show that conditions were extremely critical in the Selway area, and that the station at Pete King was really showing an extreme condition early in 1934. Gisborne was screaming to everyone that, boy, we have a blow-up situation in the Selway. During the same period, the Forest Service was doing some extensive fuel type mapping and fire planning. Fuels were rated on the ability of a fire to spread and the resistance to be controlled. Ratings ranged from low to extreme in both categories and were based on spread and control and change per hour. 66 feet equals one chain. Thus, the fuel rated high, HH, would have a high rate of spread and high resistance to control. A medium high rating, MH, would be medium in rates and spread rate and high in control resistance. The Cedar Grand Fir type produced some of the worst fuel ratings, especially in the single burn areas, which, as previously stated, covered a large portion of the Selway forest. Of the 3 escape fires that made up the Pete King fire, all started in fuels rated high or HH. Weather records from 1934 in Pete King, Locksaw, O'Hara, Moose Creek, and Coolwater Lookout disclosed the last rainfall of 0.2 inches or more was on June 27th. The next significant rain of 0.2 inches or more was on September 22nd, thus 75% below normal. Temperature and relative humidity from August 1 to September 20th were below normal. Winds were greater than average, and 1/2 fuel moisture sticks were 20% below normal. The stage is now set. The situation on August 10th, 1934, was that the Selway was already in a fire emergency. A 1,500-acre fire in Meadow Creek was in the final stages of control that evening. Most of the forest and district overhead was on the Meadow Creek fire. The ranger station firemen were in place, though there were only 1 or 2 per district. There were several project crews available, and it was felt that up to 175 men could be spared from the Meadow Creek fire. The weather forecast for August 10th and 11th, 1934, did not portray what was to come. The forecast called for generally fair weather, little change in temperature or humidity, gentle changeable winds. There was no lightning prediction in the forecast. Between 3 and 4 a.m. on August 11th, 3 dry lightning storms hit the Selway forest. At 3 o'clock, storm over the Selway Falls started 1 fire. And about the same time, a storm over Moose Creek started 7 fires. And 1/2 hour later, a storm over Pete King area started 11 fires. These storms only lasted about an hour and were left with no more than a trace. As the fires are reported, suppression action was initiated on the 19 fires reported, and all successfully brought under control with the exception of the 3 bad boys, as C.B. Sutcliffe called them in the history of the Solway fires. The 3 fires that escaped initial attack were Martin Creek, which was located west of Moose Creek Ranger Station near Tony Peak, McClendon Butte, which was located north of the Butte about 4 miles west of the Locksaw Ranger Station, and Pete King, located 7 miles up the drainage from the Pete King Ranger Station. By early afternoon of August 11th, all 3 fires were burning hot and spotting, and in some cases up to 3 miles ahead of the main fire. By nightfall, Martin Creek had burned about 1,200 acres. McClendon Butte fire was at 1,500 acres with large spots in advance of the main fire. And the Pete King fire had blossomed to 5,000 acres with spots. By mid-afternoon of the 11th, second-line defense action was being initiated. Firefighters and overhead equipment were moving toward the large fires. Fire camps were being established, and by midnight, 1,200 men were on the Pete King and McClendon Butte fires. The fires had been attacked aggressively, but were overwhelming for the number of the men available for the initial attack, and it took time to organize and mobilize for the second line of defense. August 12th saw more reinforcements arriving, crews and overhead from around the Solway Forest and other Region 1 forests, and regional headquarters began to bolster the fire forces. Scouting the fires was difficult due to the pall of smoke over the area. The smoke reduced visibility to less than 1 mile. On August the 13th, tragedy struck. A CC crew falling snags. 2 of the CCC crew were killed and 4 more injured. But the fire raged on, burning 6,500 more acres. Progress was being made as more men and overhead arrived and camps were established. But fire line construction was difficult and the heavy fuels and fire spread continued even on the poor burning days. Some help in fire line construction came when bulldozers brought in to help build the line. The McClendon Butte, they were brought into the McClendon Butte fire. The bulldozer had not been in existence very long, and this was the first use of them in fire line construction in Region 1. Except for the fire line built by bulldozers, which was about 20 miles, the shovel, Pulaski, and crosscut saw were the tools used for fire line construction. From August 12th to the fire line went along fairly well in spite of 14,000 more acres being burned. The fires were beginning to reach a large proportion. It's difficult to estimate, but by the 17th, the fires were over 20,000 acres. This was the day that, according to C.B. Sutcliffe's report, all hell busted loose. By the nightfall of August 17th, 53,000 more acres were blackened. About noon, a very strong shifting north and west wind of about 20 to 25 miles per hour started causing havoc with all the fires. Howard Flint, the regional fire control officer, was scouting the fires by airplane when the blow-up occurred. He estimated the smoke column at 40,000 feet above the fires and visible in Spokane, Washington, and Grangeville, Idaho. Smoke drift from the fires darkened the skies in Missoula, Montana, and the Bitterroot Valley. All the old-timers on the fire said they had never seen or experienced the likes of the spread heat and smoke before, and these were men who had fought fires in the bad years of 1910 and 1919. The fire jumped the Lochsaw River at the mouth of Pete King Creek. A crew with a gas-powered pump saved the buildings. Witnesses saw the fire cross the Lochsaw River at the Macaroni Creek and run to the top of Huckleberry Ridge, a distance of 2 miles in approximately 3 minutes. A valiant fight was carried out at the Lochsaw Ranger Station to save it from burning. The buildings were all saved and no lives were lost. There were several crews that had to run for their lives and get into the area already burned. Following is a partial account that was written on the fire after a crew had made a narrow escape. This is a dramatic account by H.D. Buckweaver, Camp Superintendent of CCC Camp 148, Clearwater National Forest. And this is what he wrote. Lochsaw Ranger Station, Selway National Forest, August 18th, 1934. Death by some odd turn of fate tossed aside its sinister role for a few brief hours yesterday, and 240 men struggled to safety in these rock-jutted canyon walls, rivaling the most devastating Holocaust of 1910. A forest fire of unknown proportions gutted the Lochsaw River, leaving in its wake a smoldering and blackened forest and a grimy troop of humans, thankful that a miracle had ushered them through the jaws of death and left them exhausted and unharmed. As I write this by the aid of a lantern in midday, I am amazed at the spectacle. Scattered about over the blackened ground, huddle sleeping men and boys. They lie like dead men after a night of terror during which some struggled against great odds with calm and deliberate action, while others had the fear of eternity in their eyes and prayers for deliverance from the red demon on their lips. The first information that something was ready to break loose came at 3 p.m. along the Fish Creek section of the fire, where 150 CC boys and woodsmen were battling the flames. The wind switched suddenly and whisked the fire out of control. Simultaneously, a deafening roar developed higher up the mountain. Word came up the fire line that the fire had crossed the trail behind us. Sensing the danger, we consulted with all the foremen and immediately ordered a retreat. A careful check was made to determine that not a single man was left behind. The CCC boys were sent ahead with the foresters, and woodsmen brought up the rear in a desperate 3-mile dash down a mountain trail. As the party progressed, the wind continued to increase into gale force, and the dull red glow of the crown fire lit the horizon behind us as it approached at a terrific speed. The noise became deafening. Huge chunks of limbs or treetops and burning brands hurled through the air overhead. Trees that had withstood the fury of the elements for centuries snapped off like jackstraws and crashed to the ground. The firefighters, wearied from a week of dogged firefighting, found a new reserve of energy. Obstacles which ordinarily would delay progress became trifles. Men hurled over logs and rocks as the flash of flames continued to eat up the short distance behind us as we raced downward. Spot fires were starting in all directions, breaking into spasms of leaping flames with almost explosive violence. The air was filled with ashes, giving the tinder dry forest the appearance of a muddy darkness. Tense-voiced men exhorted those in the lead to greater exertion. Lungs harmed with a dull ache and dry tongues licked ash cake lips. It was a race with death. Near panic gripped the hearts of every last man when the vanguard brought up sharp against a wall of flame. A hurried consultation was held and a route down around the fire was selected, which led down a treacherous creek bottom. The main fire was close upon us. Those who still carried tools cast them to the wind. Every second, every pound counted. Traveling in the dense growth along the creek slowed us up. Impatience, bred of desperation, brought muttered curses and staccato-like orders from the foresters. Timber was falling in all directions. Twice, just ahead of me, falling trees missed hitting some of the CC boys by inches. Undaunted, they leaped over the fallen trunks as if it were matches. The most dramatic incident occurred just as we were emerging into Fish Creek and the only trail leading to the river in safety. A giant cedar tree crashed along the line of men with only the warning shouts of those coming behind to tell of impending danger. The men pressed into the brush on either side of the trail, and no sooner had the trunk landed in the trail than fleeting feet stomped over it. We reached Fish Creek just in nick of time. The spot fire we circled had become the main fire. It was practically licking our shoe leather. Just across the creek, a new fire was hedging us with lightning-like rapidity. We now had two fires to race. The crossing of the creek on a high footlog was perilous. The wind was coming upstream with hurricane velocity. Men were forced to crawl on hands and knees to progress. One boy, Van Zant, was blown bodily off the log into the churning water. Other CCs snatched him to safety. Several boys were badly bruised by limbs and chunks which sailed through the air. Once the main trail was reached, there remained about 1/2 mile between safety and us. With unhampered going, the cavalcade raced headlong with wild abandon, while the sudden roar of the oncoming inferno sent a quaking fear to the depths of every man's soul. Victory was in sight, with precious seconds marking time between safety and destruction. Sighs of relief and offerings of silent thanks were written on every face when the party broke out of the canyon into the view of the rushing waters of the Lochsaw River. No time was lost in making the men secure. A human chain was formed. Those who could swim holding a non-swimmer between them, they negotiated the sullen torrent to the opposite side from the fire. Many said prayers, others crossed themselves, while the more stoic mountain men nodded to each other with stained grins. Thus Buck Weaver's crew was safe. And while Buck Weaver and the crew were making their dramatic escape, another fight for life and property was being carried out at the Lochsaw Ranger Station. Following was an account from the diary of I.V. Anderson, forester, Northern Rocky Mountain Experiment Station, Missoula, Montana, who was assigned to the fire along with 250 CCCs. August 17th, 4:30 p.m., Lochsaw Ranger Station. All the same as twilight because of smoke. Lights in kitchen and office. Large embers falling around station. Started pump to wet down buildings and station grounds. Sent foreman downriver to check on safety of Weaver's men. 5:30, men all accounted for. Men who came in from Fish Creek reported Weaver called men offline at 3 p.m. and has taken them down to the main lock saw. 6:20. Valentine reports are rechecked that all men from Fish Creek Line are safe. 7:30. Big blow up comes at station. Hundreds of burning embers falling in the flat below station and fire starting simultaneously, with all hands fighting with buckets, sacks, and blankets. 7:30 p.m. Food, tents, and bedding put in the river. 7:45, station circled by fire, all hands fighting to save station. Winds and velocity recorded with blowing gusts from downriver with a speed that causes men to buckle up to face it. All men's faces are covered with wet handkerchiefs, blankets, and towels. The cook throws bucket of coffee on fire on cookhouse. 7:50, hose line burned out. 8:10, fire at climax, blazing inferno on all sides. 8:15 p.m., crest of the fire passed. We are reasonably certain that buildings are safe. 8:20, we know we have won.